My name is Evelyn Hart, and I was 30 years old the night I learned my mother's poverty had been wearing a costume. It happened at my sister Kendra's engagement party, inside the Whitcomb Country Club outside Charlotte, where the carpets were softer than anything in my apartment, and every woman in the room seemed to know how to laugh without showing her teeth. My mother, Darlene Hart, stood near the bar in a faded navy dress and the fake pearl necklace I had bought her at Walmart 2 Christmases earlier. She looked small under the chandelier, but not ashamed. At least, that was what I told myself. For 9 years, I had believed she was broke. I had paid her electric bills, her prescription copays, the tires on her old Buick, and the repairs on the mobile home she swore was falling apart one storm at a time. I had skipped vacations, delayed dental work, and told myself that helping your mother was not a sacrifice if you loved her enough. Then I heard Vivian Whitcomb laugh behind a half-open door. She looks like trailer trash in a church dress. I stopped walking. My first instinct was to turn around and defend my mother. I wanted to walk into that room and make Vivian repeat it to my face. But before I moved, Mason Whitcomb, my sister's fiancé, lowered his voice and said something that froze me harder than the insult ever could. Don't worry. Once Kendra gets the Blue Ridge money, none of this matters. Blue Ridge money. I stood there with my hand on the hallway wall, listening to my own heartbeat. My mother had cried to me the week before because she said she could not afford her blood pressure medication. That night, my mother heard them call her trash. But I heard the first crack in a lie worth millions. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet your phone battery is at 30% right now, right? If that's true, type 1. If not, type 2. Let's see whether I got it right. Alright, enough talking, let's begin the story. I did not walk into that room. I did not defend my mother, even though every old instinct in me rose up, ready to do it. I backed away from the half-open door, found the ladies' room at the end of the hall, and locked myself in the last stall with my palms pressed against my knees until I could breathe without making a sound. The insult should have been the thing that stayed with me. Vivian Whitcomb's smooth little laugh. The way cruelty sounded different when it came wrapped in pearls and perfume. But it wasn't her voice that followed me into that bathroom. It was Mason's. Blue Ridge money. Money had always been the shadow in our family. Not wealth, not planning, not inheritance, just shortage. My mother had a way of living one bill away from disaster, and somehow that disaster always arrived right after my paycheck cleared. She never asked for anything large enough to make me question it. That was the trick. A little for medicine, a little because the Buick needed work, a little because the county sent a notice she did not understand, a little because the roof made a strange sound during the last storm. The first time I helped her, I was 21, and still sleeping on a mattress without a frame. She called me crying over an electric bill for $186.13. I remember the exact number, because I had only $209 in my checking account, and I still told her it was fine. I told her I had it. I told her not to worry. After that, "I've got it" became the role I played. At work, I reviewed insurance claims for patterns people hoped nobody would notice. Repeated billing codes, convenient dates, stories that changed just enough to stay believable. I was trained to recognize manipulation when it came printed on forms. But at home, I mistook the same pattern for love. Kendra never had to say, "I've got it." That was the difference between us. When her beauty studio missed rent, Mom called it a rough season. When Kendra overdrew her account, Mom said stress made her careless. When she forgot to visit for Mother's Day, Mom said young women needed room to breathe. But when I was tired, I was capable. When I was scared, I was responsible. When I was running out of money, I was still the strong one. "You're fine, Evelyn," my mother used to say. "You always figure things out." Sitting in that country club bathroom, I finally understood how dangerous that sentence was. It had never meant she believed in me. It meant she had permission to keep taking from me. I left the engagement party early by telling Kendra I had a headache. She barely looked up from Mason's arm when she hugged me goodbye, her diamond catching the chandelier light every time she moved her hand. My mother noticed, though. Across the marble foyer, she studied my face for one quiet second, like she was checking whether I had heard something I was not supposed to hear. Then, she gave me that tired little smile she used whenever she wanted me to remember she was delicate. On the drive back to Asheville, I kept both hands on the wheel and left the radio off. The road through the mountains was dark, and I spent every mile trying to talk myself out of what I knew. Maybe Mason had exaggerated. Maybe Blue Ridge money belonged to his family. Maybe grief and exhaustion had made me hear the wrong thing. By the time I reached my apartment, I had almost convinced myself that being reasonable was the same as being safe. 4 days later, on Thursday, I stopped by my mother's mobile home after work with the groceries she had asked for. From the outside, everything looked exactly the way it always did. Faded aluminum siding, 2 plastic chairs on the porch, a cracked flower pot beside the steps. Near the mailboxes, June Calloway, the park manager, was leaning over a clipboard. "Your mom home?" I asked. June pushed her glasses up. "Not yet, honey. She had her first Thursday ride." I looked at her. "Her what?" "The black Lincoln. Comes most first Thursdays. Driver waits right by the office." I figured it was some church appointment. That morning at 8:17, my mother had called me with a weak voice and told me she was too dizzy to drive. She needed $60 for gas and a few groceries until her check came. I had sent it before my coffee cooled. For the first time, I treated my mother's story like one of the claim files on my desk, the kind where the dates lined up too neatly and the explanation worked only if you never asked a second question. That night, I called her and said I could not send anything else that month. My rent had gone up, I told her. I needed to be careful. There was a pause. Then came the soft cough, the wounded silence, the gentle little sigh. "Oh, don't worry about me, baby. I'm used to making do." 2 nights later, I followed the address June had mentioned. I parked across from a downtown steakhouse and watched my mother step out beneath the warm gold lights in a cream-colored coat I had never seen before. Beside her was an older man in a tailored gray suit. I did not know his name yet. Later, I would learn it was Simon Bellamy. She was not limping. She was not trembling. She was laughing. And in that moment, I did not see a poor woman surviving. I saw my mother performing poverty for an audience of one. I did not sleep much after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother standing under those steakhouse lights, laughing in a cream-colored coat that looked softer than anything she had ever allowed me to buy for myself. By morning, I had stopped asking whether I had misunderstood Mason at the engagement party. I started asking what else I had been trained not to see. At work, I waited until lunch and carried my food to the break room, where Rosa Finch was heating soup in the microwave with one hand and marking up a fraud report with the other. Rosa had been in insurance investigations for 14 years. She was the kind of woman who could look at a spreadsheet and hear it holding its breath. I told her only enough to keep myself from sounding crazy. My mother had been claiming poverty for years. I had seen her downtown with a man I did not recognize. Someone at my sister's engagement party had mentioned something called Blue Ridge money. I needed to know whether that phrase existed anywhere outside my own panic. Rosa studied me for a moment. "Public records only," she said. "Public records only," I promised. So that was where we started. County property searches, tax assessments, old deed transfers, trust references, nothing private, nothing stolen, nothing that required a password or a favor. Just the kind of information people leave in plain sight because they assume the daughter paying the bills is too tired to look. At first, there was nothing under Darlene Hart except exactly what I expected. No house, no land, no mortgage, just the mobile home lot and a mailing address I knew by heart. Then Rosa tried my father's middle name. The screen refreshed. Blue Ridge Family Preservation Trust. The name hit me before the property did. Simon Bellamy. Trustee of record. The man from the steakhouse. Rosa clicked into the filing, and the break room seemed to shrink around the hum of the vending machine. The trust was connected to a cabin outside Black Mountain. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, Mountain View, updated septic, last assessed at $860,000. The mailing contact was my mother's post office box. I did not speak. I kept staring at the number, waiting for it to become something else. 2 weeks earlier, my mother had let me pay $1,400 for a heating repair she said she could not handle. That same month, the cabin's property taxes had been paid in full, early, from an account I had never heard of. Rosa sat back slowly. "That isn't poverty, Evelyn," she said. "That's structure." I printed the page with steady hands. They did not start shaking until I was alone in my car. Then I folded it once, slid it into my purse, and understood that Blue Ridge money was not a misunderstanding. It was a door. And for the first time, I had found the handle. The printed trust record stayed in my purse for 3 days before I had the courage to unfold it at home. I carried it from room to room like a thing that might become less real if I refused to look at it under my own kitchen light. On the 4th night, I opened my laptop, pulled up 9 years of bank statements, and did what my job had trained me to do. I stopped feeling and started counting. Every transfer, every check, every pharmacy charge, every temporary loan until her Social Security cleared. Every late insurance premium she said would ruin her credit. Every storm deductible. Every urgent balance she needed handled before Friday. I made columns for dates, amounts, reasons, and the exact words she had used when she asked. The hardest column was the one I labeled notes, because that was where I typed the sentences I remembered too well. "Please don't tell Kendra. She has enough on her plate. You're the only one I can ask." By midnight, the total was $291,000. By 2 in the morning, after I found old checks from my first credit union account, it was $312,000. I stared at that number until the screen blurred. $312,000 was not help. It was the house I never tried to buy. It was the graduate program I talked myself out of. It was the emergency fund I never built because my mother always had an emergency first. The next afternoon, I called Aunt Lorraine Mercer, my father's younger sister. We had drifted after Dad died, the way families sometimes do when grief leaves everyone facing different walls. When I asked whether Dad had ever said anything about what he wanted for me and Kendra, she went quiet. "Come after work," she said. Her house smelled like lemon polish and old paper. She set a shoebox on the kitchen table and opened it with both hands. Inside were birthday cards, tax receipts, faded photographs, and one folded letter with my name and Kendra's written in my father's blocky handwriting. I read it twice. He wanted us treated equally. Not almost equally. Not according to who needed more rescuing. Equally. One line made my throat close. Evelyn should never be punished for being the one who can stand upright. Then Aunt Lorraine slid one more page across the table. She said a notary named Marisol Grant had mailed it after recognizing my father's name in the trust paperwork. Marisol had written only one sentence on a sticky note. "I don't think he would have wanted this hidden. It was a recent amendment." Kendra's name appeared beside 92%, the cabin, investment distributions, and mineral royalty proceeds. Mine sat near the bottom beside keepsakes and a fixed amount so small it felt less like inheritance than hush money. I laid my father's letter beside my mother's trust page and finally understood. She had not forgotten what fairness looked like. She had chosen against it. I drove home from Aunt Lorraine's with my father's letter on the passenger seat and the trust amendment tucked beneath it, as if one piece of paper could protect the other from what my mother had done. For the first time in weeks, I did not feel scattered. I felt organized. Pain had edges now. It had dates, signatures, property records, and numbers that could be printed. The next morning, I brought copies to Rosa, before work. She did not gasp when she read them. She did not perform outrage for my benefit. Rosa had never been that kind of woman. She sat at her desk with her coffee untouched, moving from page to page with the careful silence of someone handling evidence instead of family gossip. When she finished, she pulled a yellow legal pad from her drawer and drew a line down the middle. On one side, she said, what your mother told you. On the other, what the records show. That became the beginning of the binder. I called June Calloway next and asked if she would be willing to write down only what she had personally seen. I expected hesitation. Instead, she sighed, like a woman who had been waiting for someone to ask the right question. Honey, I don't like family mess, she said, but I don't like watching a daughter get played either. By Friday, June had written a simple statement: the car, the driver, the first, Thursday, pattern, and the slim leather folder my mother carried when she returned. It did not prove the whole lie. It proved there had been a second life. That weekend, Aunt Lorraine called me with Marisol Grant on speakerphone. Marisol was careful, and I respected that. She did not read private documents to me. She did not gossip about my mother's estate. She only confirmed what she could honestly say, if a lawyer ever asked her under oath. Darlene had been clear, calm, and fully aware when she signed. No one rushed her. No one confused her. No one held her hand through a decision she did not understand. That closed the last soft door in my mind. Then came Reverend Calvin Price. I called the church office because Kendra had asked me to confirm the seating list for our side of the family. Reverend Price was kind, distracted, and far too honest for a man holding a secret he did not know was one. We'll have your mother's announcement right before the family blessing prayer, he said. She sounded very excited about the cabin gift. I closed my eyes. There it was. My mother had not only chosen Kendra, she had chosen an audience. And if she wanted to turn favoritism into a ceremony, then I would bring the truth to the front pew. For 2 days after Reverend Price mentioned the cabin gift, I moved through my life with a strange calm. I went to work. I answered emails. I reviewed claims. I stood in line at the grocery store behind a woman buying birthday candles and watched the cashier count change. Everything looked ordinary, which made the truth feel even more unreal. The binder sat on my kitchen table every night. I added June's statement, Rosa's notes, the trust page, the cabin record, the spreadsheet of money I had sent, and my father's letter. I told myself the worst was already in front of me. I was wrong. It came from Marisol. She called Aunt Lorraine first, then asked if she could speak to me directly. Her voice was nervous in the careful way honest people sound when they are about to step closer to trouble than they planned. I found something I think you need to hear, she said. She would not send me a file. She would not give me anything that did not belong to her, but she had kept a personal memo from the day my mother signed the latest trust amendment because something about the conversation had bothered her. Not the legality, the tone. I drove to Aunt Lorraine's after work. Marisol was there, sitting at the kitchen table with her coat still on, both hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee she had not touched. She placed a single typed note in front of me. It was not a transcript, not an official record, just the words she had written for herself after the appointment. I read the line once, then again. According to Marisol's memo, Simon Bellamy had asked my mother if she understood that the new distribution would leave me with very little compared to Kendra. My mother had answered, Evelyn can handle disappointment. She always has. Kendra can't. The room did not spin. I almost wish it had. Instead, it became painfully clear. I could hear the refrigerator hum. I could see a tiny crack in the yellow glaze of Aunt Lorraine's sugar bowl. I could feel the paper under my fingers. That sentence did not sound confused. It did not sound pressured. It sounded like a decision. I did not cry in front of Marisol. I thanked her. I folded the memo carefully and placed it in the binder behind my father's letter. That night, I sat in my car outside my apartment until the porch lights around the complex blinked on one by one. I was not forgotten. I was measured. And then I was sacrificed on purpose. The next morning, I woke up with the porch light still burned into my memory and my neck stiff from sitting too long in the car. For a few minutes, I lay there and let the quiet tell me what the night before had already decided. I was not going to beg my mother for an explanation. I was not going to ask Kendra whether she knew. People who wanted to tell the truth did not usually need to be chased down and cornered into it. At work, I opened my email and found a message from the wedding printer with the subject line, "Final Program Proof Heart, Whitcomb Wedding." Kendra had copied me the week before because, in her words, I was better with details. I almost laughed when I saw that. Even now, even this close to the knife, they still trusted me to keep the edges neat. I downloaded the attachment and scanned the pages without much interest at first. Bridal party, scripture reading, soloist, prayer. Then I reached the section marked Family Blessing. Under my mother's name, in elegant italic font, were the words, "Presentation of the Blue Ridge Cabin and investment support for Kendra and Mason." I sat so still, my screen began to dim. Kendra and Mason. Not just Kendra. Both of them. The cabin was not a sentimental gift from a mother to a daughter. It was being introduced as a foundation for their marriage, polished up for applause, wrapped in prayer, and placed in front of everyone as if generosity and favoritism were the same thing. I forwarded the program to myself and printed 2 copies. Then, because the universe apparently had not finished insulting me, a second email arrived 5 minutes later. This one came from Kendra, sent to me by mistake, in a reply chain with Mason. I knew it was meant for the wedding planner, but my name sat in the copied line like an accident with a purpose. Mason had written, "Once the cabin is transferred, Dad says we can leverage it for the Charlotte office. Better to move fast before Evelyn starts asking questions." Kendra's reply was shorter. "Mom said Evelyn will be hurt, but she'll get over it. She always does." I read that sentence, and something inside me went colder than anger. Until then, some stubborn part of me had still been protecting Kendra. I had told myself she was spoiled, maybe selfish, maybe sheltered by our mother's choices, but not cruel. Not knowingly cruel. But there it was, written in her own words. My sister was not standing outside the lie. She was standing in the middle of it, holding a bouquet. By noon, the binder no longer felt like something I had built to understand my family. It felt like something I needed to survive them. I left work early and drove to a small law office on Merriman Avenue with my hands locked around the steering wheel. The sign outside read Naomi Keene, Estate Disputes and Financial Abuse. I had found her name through Rosa, who knew a woman from church who had used Naomi after her brother emptied their father's accounts. That was how these stories traveled, quietly, from one damaged family to another. Naomi was in her late 50s, with silver hair cut at her jaw and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She did not rush me. She did not widen her eyes at the numbers. She simply opened a legal pad and let me talk until my voice started to sound like it belonged to someone else. I showed her the transfer spreadsheet first, then the cabin record, the trust amendment, the printer's proof, my father's letter, June's statement, Marisol's memo, and the email from Kendra and Mason. Naomi read everything in order. Every few pages, she wrote one word in the margin: pattern, reliance, knowledge, intent. When she finished, she folded her hands on top of the binder. "I need you to understand something," she said. "Money you gave willingly is difficult to recover. A judge may see many of those transfers as gifts." I nodded, even though the word gifts made my stomach tighten. "But," she continued, "if your mother presented herself as financially distressed while knowingly concealing substantial assets, and if you relied on that presentation to your own financial harm, that is not nothing. It may not be simple, but it is not nothing." That was the first honest comfort anyone had given me. Not a promise, not revenge, dressed up as certainty. Just a door that had not fully closed. Naomi tapped the binder once. "Do not confront them alone. Do not threaten. Do not exaggerate. Keep everything factual. If the wedding becomes the place where they announce this transfer, then the facts need to be cleaner than their performance." Cleaner than their performance. I wrote that down. Before I left, Naomi made copies of the strongest pages and gave me one instruction. Build a timeline. Not a speech. Not a breakdown. A timeline. Dates, amounts, documents, witnesses. Let the order do the accusing. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and rebuilt the binder from the beginning. For the first time in my life, I stopped arranging my memories around guilt. I arranged them around evidence. The rehearsal dinner was held the night before the wedding in a private room at the old hotel downtown, the kind of place with brass elevators, dark wood walls, and waiters who refilled water glasses before anyone noticed they were empty. Kendra had chosen it because she said it felt timeless. Mason said it looked expensive in photographs. That was the difference between them, though by then, I was not sure it mattered. I arrived with the binder in my car, locked in the trunk beneath a wool coat. Naomi's voice stayed in my head the whole drive there. Do not threaten, do not exaggerate, keep everything factual. So I wore a black dress, small earrings, and the calm face I had spent 30 years perfecting for family events where my feelings were considered inconvenient. My mother was already seated when I walked in. She had chosen an old floral dress I recognized from church dinners years ago, the one with a frayed hem if you looked closely. Around the Whitcombs, she lowered her shoulders and softened her voice, slipping back into the part she knew best. Poor Darlene. Humble Darlene. Grateful Darlene, who had raised 2 girls with nothing but coupons and prayer. At one point, I heard her tell Mason's aunt that I had always been good about helping out when things got tight. The woman looked at me with warm admiration, as if I were some kind of saint. I almost laughed. Kendra sat beside Mason, glowing under the chandelier, accepting compliments as if she had not written that I would get over it. Every few minutes, she touched his sleeve or leaned into him, performing softness with the same skill my mother performed helplessness. Then, Vivian Whitcomb raised her glass. To Kendra, she said, smiling across the table. A woman lucky enough to be lifted into the kind of life every mother dreams for her daughter. A few people chuckled. My mother smiled politely. I saw it then, clear as a signature. She did not mind being looked down on, not if Kendra got to climb. After dessert, Darlene caught me near the hallway outside the restrooms. Her hand closed around my wrist, gentle enough for witnesses, firm enough for me to understand. Tomorrow is your sister's day, she said. Please don't do anything to upset her. I looked at her hand, then at her face. For years, that sentence would have folded me in half. It would have sent me home ashamed, rehearsing all the ways I could make myself smaller. This time, I only said, I won't do anything wrong, Mom. Her eyes flickered. I'll only tell the truth. She let go of my wrist like it had burned her. The wedding began at 2 o'clock the next afternoon in a white Baptist church with stained glass windows and a choir loft full of winter light. I sat on the bride's side, second row, with the binder on the pew beside my purse. From the outside, I probably looked calm. Inside, every breath had to be chosen. Kendra came down the aisle, smiling like nothing in the world had ever been denied to her. Mason watched her with a polished kind of tenderness, the kind that looked perfect from a distance and empty up close. My mother sat in the front row with a folded envelope in her lap, dressed in soft blue, her eyes damp before anyone had said a word. The ceremony moved exactly as printed. Scripture, prayer, vows, rings. Then Reverend Calvin Price stepped forward and smiled at the congregation. At this time, Mrs. Darlene Hart would like to offer a family blessing. My mother rose slowly. She glanced at me once, then looked away. Her voice trembled just enough to sound humble. I have not had much in this life, she began, but what I do have, I want to use to help the child who needs it most. Kendra lowered her head beautifully. Mason placed his hand over hers. My mother continued, Today, I am giving Kendra and Mason the Blue Ridge cabin, along with investment support to help them begin their marriage with security. The room warmed with soft applause. I stood. The applause thinned, then stopped. Before my mother could sit, I picked up the binder and walked into the aisle. My voice did not shake. That surprised me more than anyone. Before my mother gives my sister a cabin worth $860,000, I said, I think everyone here should know that last month she let me pay a medical bill she claimed she could not afford. My mother went still. Kendra whispered my name like a warning. I opened the binder. Over 9 years, I transferred $312,000 to my mother for emergencies she said she could not survive without help. During that time, she held assets through the Blue Ridge Family Preservation Trust. A murmur moved through the pews. I read the facts the way Naomi had taught me. Dates, amounts, records, the cabin, the investment distributions, the mineral royalties, the trust amendment giving Kendra 92%, my father's letter asking that both daughters be treated equally. Then I read the line from Marisol's memo. Evelyn can handle disappointment. She always has. Kendra can't. That was when my mother finally looked at me. I closed the binder. You were right about one thing, Mom, I said. I can handle disappointment. What I will not handle anymore is being used because of it. Mason stepped forward, face tight. This is inappropriate. I looked at him. So is leveraging a wedding gift before the bride has even left the church. No one laughed. No one moved. Then I turned back to my mother. You were never poor, I said quietly. You just let me live like you were, because you knew I would not abandon you. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of every lie finally losing its place to hide. The reception did not happen the way Kendra had planned. People still walked to the hotel because deposits had been paid and food was waiting under silver lids, but the room felt less like a celebration than a place everyone had agreed to stand until they figured out what story they were allowed to tell later. Mason disappeared for almost an hour with his father. When he came back, he would not look at Kendra directly. Vivian kept her smile pinned on, but it had gone thin at the edges. My mother sat at a table near the window, with her hands folded around the envelope she had never gotten to finish presenting. For the first time in my life, she looked old to me. Not poor, not helpless, just old enough to understand that a role can become a prison when the audience stops believing it. Kendra found me near the coat room before I left. You humiliated me, she said. I looked at my little sister in her white dress, mascara gathered beneath her eyes, and waited for the old guilt to rise. It did not. No, I said. I interrupted something you already knew was wrong. She opened her mouth, but nothing useful came out. Maybe there was no sentence left that could make her small enough to be innocent again. 3 days later, I sat in Naomi Keene's office and signed the paperwork that ended my part in my mother's performance. No more automatic transfers, no more emergency loans. No more bills paid because a shaky voice on the phone knew exactly where to press. Naomi began the formal letters, careful and factual, requesting records and preserving my right to challenge the trust. I did not get $312,000 back that week. I may never get all of it back. Life is not that neat, and family law does not hand you justice just because your heartbreak is well documented. But I got something I had never had before. A boundary with my name on it. My mother called 9 times the first Sunday. The first messages were soft, then wounded, then angry. By the last one, she sounded almost like herself. I never thought you would treat your own mother this way. I listened once, then deleted it. That night, I set up an automatic transfer into my own savings account. It was only $75, but I watched the confirmation screen longer than I needed to. Then, I framed my father's letter and hung it above my desk. Some families do not use you because you are weak. They use you because you are strong, because they believe you will survive whatever they take. And maybe you will, but surviving is not the same as owing them more. What Evelyn's story teaches us is that strength can become a burden when the wrong people start depending on it. In many families, the reliable person is not always protected. Sometimes, they are used. They are the one everyone calls when bills are due, when emotions are heavy, when someone needs rescuing, fixing, forgiving, or understanding. And because they keep showing up, people begin to mistake their endurance for permission. But being strong does not mean you do not hurt. Being responsible does not mean you should always pay the price. And loving your family does not mean letting them quietly drain the life out of you while calling it duty. The deepest betrayal in this story was not just about money. It was about a mother who knew which daughter would break loudly and which daughter would break silently. then rewarded the loud one and sacrificed the quiet one. That kind of pain is hard to explain, because from the outside, it can look like generosity, tradition, or family obligation. But inside, it feels like being punished for surviving. Evelyn's victory was not that she got everything back. She may never recover every dollar, every year, or every version of herself she gave away. Her real victory was the moment she stopped confusing guilt with love. She finally understood that a boundary is not cruelty. Sometimes, a boundary is the first honest act of self-respect a person has ever been allowed to make. Family should be a place where love is shared, not where one person is quietly assigned to carry everyone else's comfort. So, tell me in the comments, have you ever seen the strong one in a family get treated like they do not need care, help, or fairness? If this story moved you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Your strength matters too.